All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lifelong learning lecture. We're very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Ira Silver, Professor of Sociology at FSU, for his lecture, Athletes and the Mental Health Crisis. I'm Tara Hall, and I'm a Media and Program Specialist here at the Framingham Library. And just a few notes before we begin tonight. If you haven't already, I'm going to ask that you please mute yourself to avoid any unintended interruptions. I will be dropping a link to our online evaluation form in the chat later this evening. And we welcome any feedback you have about tonight's lecture, as well as any ideas you have for topics for future lectures. And with that, I'd also like to promote our next lecture, which is going to be May 16th, Cultural Competency Ingredients for Student Success with Dr. Jeffrey Coleman. And please note that lecture, like this lecture, is going to take place on Zoom only. There'll be no meeting in person in the Costin Room or streaming on YouTube. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Silver.
Tara, thank you. In July of 2021, as you may remember, just a few years ago, American gymnast Simone Biles did something that completely shook the world, and something for which she will always be remembered. It wasn't, as was the case beforehand, typically for Simone, something she did on the balance beam. There was no amazing feat there, on the uneven bars, or on the floor mat. Rather, the amazing feat that she accomplished was, in fact, not competing. She withdrew from Olympic competition. This was an absolutely stunning event. Again, you may remember this because it was very much in the public eye. You can kind of put yourself back into that time and place. This was 2021. The Olympics were supposed to happen a year ago. They didn't happen in 2020 because of COVID. And the world was really awaiting, the sports world, but really the world who follows the Olympics, those who were concerned, were really awaiting this moment. Simone Biles in 2016 at the prior Olympics had won 4 gold medals and 1 bronze. And she's won in all 19 golds at the World Championship. In fact, she is the most decorated American gymnast in history, winning 32 medals across both the Olympics and the World Championship. I'm going to be sharing my screen intermittently throughout the evening to give you some images and some context of what I want to talk about. There's Simone Biles, and she posted on Instagram the reasons for her not competing, right? I'll just read it out loud. She says, I say put mental health first, because if you don't, then you're not going to enjoy your sport and you're not going to succeed as much as you want to. So it's okay sometimes to even sit out the big competitions, to focus on yourself, because it shows how strong of a competitor and person that you really are. Notice Simone, who is considered one of the strongest competitors of any gymnast, of any American athlete, really, is saying that her strength comes from not competing, right, rather than just battling it out. And what's noteworthy about her decision not to compete on the biggest stage of her life following the Rio Olympics in 2016, again, this was in 2021, the Olympics that were supposed to be a year earlier, was that it came on the heels, just weeks earlier, another star-studded American female athlete, Naomi Osaka, had won the Australian Open in January of that year. And for those who follow tennis, there are 4 big events that it's very, very rare to win all 4. You win the Australian, then the French Open, then Wimbledon, and then the US Open. So she was at the French Open. She cruised to an easy victory in her first match. And then at the beginning of her second match, she too withdrew, not just from the match, but of course from the tournament. And she also, of course, this was before Simone Biles, posted something very similar on Instagram. She said, "The truth is that I have suffered long bouts of depression since the US Open in 2018. And I've had a really hard time coping with that. Anyone that knows me knows I'm introverted. And anyone who has ever seen me at the tournaments will notice that I'm often wearing headphones. So that helps due to my social anxiety. Though the tennis press has always, right here, the tennis press has always been kind to me, and I want to apologize especially to all the cool journalists who I may have hurt. I am not a natural public speaker, and I get huge waves of anxiety before I speak to the media." I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's a rainy night, which makes the fact that we're on Zoom perhaps fitting and not in person. I am a sociologist by training, and I teach a sport at Framingham State, a course at Framingham State University called Sport and Society, from which the thoughts that I want to share with you tonight are derived. And I think there's really one big question that underlies the similar behaviors by Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles in the summer of 2021. And the question is this: what can we learn from these two athletes' decisions to withdraw from competing on the biggest stages in their respective sports because of mental health? What are the larger lessons that we can take? And it's really these larger lessons about our society and our world that is what's exciting about teaching this course. Again, it's called Sport and Society. And what's neat about this course is that so many people, and including no doubt many, if not all the people here tonight, have at least a tangential, if not a very enthusiastic interest in sports, as do many of my students who take this course. And what's neat about the course, and what I'm going to share with you tonight that's sort of emblematic about the course, is it takes us beyond the game. And it shows that what happens off the field, off the court, is often more interesting than what happens on it. And one topic in the course that is what I want to share with you in the time we have tonight is about situations when athletes are doing something in addition to trying to perform as best they can on the court or on the field and trying to win games. Rather, they are promoting agendas and interests that have little, if anything, to do with the game itself. I'm talking about the long history of athletes acting as essentially as political activists. And I want to take that long history and make it very brief for you to encapsulate it as a way of understanding what we can learn about the behaviors, the actions, the not competing by Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, and see what that can teach us about mental illness and mental health in our society today. Well, this history goes back further than 1947, but clearly a watershed moment is one that I'm likely you're all familiar with, and that is Jackie Robinson becoming the first Black American to play in the major leagues. And that it wasn't sort of done as a political act, but it clearly became the beginning of a movement to integrate sports of all kinds, which of course was part of the greater movement in American society to integrate dimensions of the society that had been segregated, such as busing and public accommodations. Just giving you sort of the highlights here, 21 years later, in 1968, American gold medalist Tommie Smith, who's in the center, and American bronze medalist John Carlos on the right, raised their fists while receiving medals at the Summer Olympics. And this may be, or certainly is, one of the most iconic images in sports history. You see they're raising their fists, clearly making a political statement about the inequalities and injustices Black Americans were facing, clearly making a statement that went beyond their accomplishments as athletes. A few years later, in 1972, was the tennis match that was dubbed the Battle of the Sexes, where Billie Jean King, one of the top women's players, actually beat Bobby Riggs, and was sort of, symbolically seen as sort of kind of a way in which athletes were kind of participating in and publicizing the greater movement for women's equality. We'll fast forward a bit to perhaps the person who is the sort of the poster child of athletes as activists, and that is Colin Kaepernick, who will go down in history as not known as a particularly great football player, although he was a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, but really has been known and continues to be known as the person who sort of started the trend of National Football League players taking a knee instead of standing during the national anthem, and that being a kind of a way of protesting the injustices experienced by Black Americans at the hands of the police. Going closer to the present, there's been a movement. Again, these are all examples of athletes or sports taking on a meaning that's about activism, about something that goes beyond sports. In 2021, the Major League Baseball team that had played in Cleveland for many, many, many years changed its name from the Indians to the Guardians. The idea that taking on Native American names, mascots, and logos, there has been, continues to be, a strong movement to pressure teams at all levels, from youth leagues to high schools to colleges, and of course to the pros to discard those names, mascots, and labels. It also happened with the National Football League team that plays in Washington. The owner had said at one point, we will absolutely never, ever change our name from the Redskins, and they did in 2022. They're now the Commanders. And on the subject of Native American activism, there was a lot of activism at the last two Super Bowls because the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that has not changed their name, that earned a lot of revenue in part because of their name, there were protests outside the Super Bowl. And the one that caught my eye was, of course, Taylor Swift was arguably a bigger event at that Super Bowl in her relationship with Travis Kelce. So the ad was Taylor Swift doesn't do the chop, and that's referring to the tomahawk chop that many Native American activists feel is insensitive to Native Americans. So one should be like Taylor. Let's hold on that image for just one sec. So what we have here is we have lots of different examples where, and again, situating the two that I want to focus on, these two women, Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles in 2021, they are part of this long and robust history and that continues to the present of athletes kind of asserting interests and agendas that go beyond what happens on the field, on the court, on the balance beam, et cetera. And before we go any further, I think it's important to emphasize that that we're talking about athletes as activists, that as political activists, the very idea of athletes even engaging in this kind of work is itself politicized. So you see this fan making his message very clear, play b-ball, not politics. And as a sociologist, what's really important is two things. First of all, not to take side. This talk today in the class I teach, it's not about saying, isn't this a great thing what these activists are doing? They're promoting causes that are so important. It's not about getting involved politically with my ideas or the point I'm making tonight is not political, but it's also not agreeing with this fan, because if there are athletes who are going to great lengths to promote causes that go well beyond and really have nothing to do with what's going on in the game itself, then we need to take that seriously as students of this behavior, whether we agree with it or not. So whether you think it's appropriate or inappropriate for athletes to be doing this, it's appropriate for us to be analyzing what's significant, right? Because what Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka did in 2021 had a significance unlike any of these other examples that I shared with you, right? Because this wasn't about publicizing social injustice and saying that something needed to be done about it. It was very different. It was really saying that we have a problem of mental illness in our society that is not being properly addressed, and that mental illness is something that carries a tremendous amount of stigma. And that may be a word that's familiar to some, but stigma, the idea is that a person who has stigma carries a kind of a blemish, and the blemish comes not from what they have, but others' perceptions and others' views and beliefs about their condition. In this case, them having a mental illness of one kind or another. So, for a long time, mental illness has carried a stigma as somehow being a mark in the eyes of many as a kind of a personal shortcoming, a personal failure. And I want us to think about how the activism, which was very simply two of the United States' most well-known athletes saying, "I'm not playing today," right? It's sort of the power of simply saying no, which was really had never been done before. What that says, and I think it's important to put a context around this, which is to say this was 2021, and 3 years ago, and by that point in time, really you could say over the first roughly 20 years of this century, mental illness. The stigma around mental illness was already on the decline, right? People had increasingly come to see mental illness not as a sort of a personal failure, as a reason to be ostracized, but rather as a disease caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. So there'd been a lot of movement toward destigmatizing mental illness and a growing recognition that people who suffer from one or another type of mental illness. In the case of the two women, the two athletes that we're talking about, it had to do with anxiety. But certainly there's been a growing recognition beyond anxiety that people who suffer deserve help, whether it's medication or therapy or some other type of intervention. And just to give you one small tidbit of research to substantiate how mental illness by this time had at least the process of destigmatizing it had begun, there was a study that was done between 1996 and 2018 that found that there was a substantial decrease in respondents' unwillingness to socialize or work closely with someone who has depression. Now, it's a little bit of a backhanded finding in the sense that the study, of course, acknowledges that there had been for a long time, and there continues to be, a sense of stigma. Again, a sense of there's some barrier between coworkers socializing if one of them has depression. But there had been a sort of a decrease in the unwillingness to socialize with someone because they had depression. Okay, so there'd been a movement to destigmatize certain kinds of mental illness, but at the same time, the stigma as of 2021, and certainly now, just 3 years later, very much exists. And I want you to think about a few different situations that are familiar to you where you can see mental illness stigma and how alive and well it is. One of the best examples, and unfortunately we have too many scenarios from which to have such examples, is after a mass shooting. And if you can think for a moment about these events typically get a significant amount of media coverage, and the media coverage very quickly turns to kind of, why did this person do it? And often the journalists and frequently the police officers are at the scene will often make comments very quickly about mental illness being the culprit. And what's telling about this is it's not that there's not truth to that. It's not that many people who go on rampages don't suffer from mental illness. But what's telling about it is a couple things. Firstly, many shooters actually don't have a mental illness. And secondly, more importantly, is that the very kind of casual use of this phrase mental illness kind of fosters an image that anyone with such a condition, and there are many, many, many different types of conditions that fall under the umbrella of mental illness. I'm not going to go into the categorization and where that comes from. If there are questions, I can certainly do it. It goes a little bit beyond this talk, but the image that kind of comes from this is easily one that stigmatizes anyone who suffers from a mental illness, even though most of these conditions are not tied or linked to violent behavior. So that's an example you can, I think, easily relate to. Another one that you can probably easily relate to, all it takes is just thinking about kind of people's everyday language. If you think about a phrase like, "You're such a downer," which for sure you've heard and perhaps you've used, I've used it unknowingly to the point I'm about to make, which can really lead a person who experiences depression to kind of feel badly about their situation, to kind of reinforce in their mind that that their inability to have a positive mood is somehow their own fault, right? That being a downer is something that they have kind of caused. Or another example from sort of everyday speech is how a person with an anxiety disorder may similarly feel a sense of self-blame, when others kind of refer to them as sort of a nervous wreck. And this stigmatizing language has particular consequences when it comes to the portrayal of girls and women, which is a subject I want to zero in on in a minute, is the mental health crisis, particularly afflicting girls and women. But just think for a moment about how often you've heard words like crazy and nuts, clearly two pejorative words that refer to mental health or an absence of mental health. Think about how frequently you've heard those words used to describe girls and women when they're having their periods. So we have a big subject on the table here, clearly, about the continued pervasiveness of mental illness stigma. You have these two very famous, very accomplished, by which I mean on the tennis court and on the balance beam, female athletes who are on the biggest stages, the French Open and the Olympics. Doesn't get bigger than those two stages. On the biggest stages in their respective sports are making a very powerful statement about how that stigma has got to continue to be lessened, and that they believe that they have a role to play in this. I want to share with you just a tiny bit of data here to kind of zoom out from the details here. And I dare say that what is on the screen here is probably not news to any of you, which really points to this growing mental health crisis that we've seen among young people, roughly over the entirety of the 21st century to date. And what's of course striking here is that these are data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is really kind of the most reputable go-to source when it comes to collecting data. There's lots of different data sources, but this really zeroes in on teens, right? I'll just read what's at the top. Teen girls who persistently felt sad or hopeless increased dramatically right during this period from 2011 to 2021. And there's more recent data post-pandemic that makes the point that whereas during the pandemic, many of us thought, and there was a lot of reporting that kind of would have led people to reasonably believe that the pandemic was somehow a kind of an aberration. It's obvious why young people were experiencing mental health problems because of all the social distancing and limitations. But we're far enough from the pandemic to know that the data about people reporting like what's here, feelings of persistent sadness, was actually more of a blip than it was, or I should say, it was more indicative of a trend than it was a blip, which is to say that these data continue to this point. And so this is obviously a much bigger topic than this talk. This talk is really zeroing in on the role of athletes as activists, publicizing this crisis. But I want to just kind of note that this is a much bigger story, obviously, that I can't get into. But the part that I do want to zero in on is the way in which this story has particularly affected girls, as you see in the data, and more so, or especially so, particularly so, which is relevant for what we're talking about tonight, is female athletes. So here you have a picture of the athlete on the top, Katie Meyer, soccer player for Stanford, who led Stanford to the championship in 2019. You have, that's on the left is Katie Meyer. On the right, you have Lauren Burnett, softball player at James Madison University. And then on the bottom, you have Sarah Schulze, who ran track at the University of Wisconsin. These three young women are, or unfortunately I have to say, were part of a group of 5 female college athletes who took their own lives in a 6-week period in 2022. And if there's anything positive that we could possibly take from an event as horrific as a young person taking their own life, it is that I think it shines a very bright spotlight on a crisis that is particularly afflicting girls and has particular ramifications for female athletes. This here is Kaylin Bracken, lacrosse player at Vanderbilt University. Kaylin is present tense, is not among that group of 5. She continues to play lacrosse for Vanderbilt. And Kaylin, I think an appropriate way to describe her is to say that she's really a protege of Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. I think without the incredibly courageous and heroic and no doubt controversial moves of Osaka and Biles to step away from the competition on the biggest stages in their respective sports in 2021, I don't think Kaylin Bracken is a name that I would be mentioning today. And in a few minutes, I want to share, in a moment, I just want to share some of her words. You can hear from her directly from a TED Talk she gave in just last year. And what happened, and as she describes in the snippet that I'm going to play for you, that so the first of the 5 athletes who took their lives in the spring of 2022, Katie Meyer, was March 1st of 2022. And as Kaylin describes in her talk, I mean, she had experienced many of the same mental health challenges as the women who had taken their own lives, right? And it really she sees and I see, and I want to underscore for you that these 5 women are kind of like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to a very serious problem afflicting female athletes. Kaylin that night sat down, and what a student she was, because she sat down and she started writing. And she didn't stop writing until she had something very powerful on her hands, which she called a letter to college sports. And it was published online. It went online a month later, and it became viral. And that's sort of a kind of a wonderful silver lining to a very dark story, is the way the publicity of this crisis is not something that only 2 of the most famous female athletes in the U.S. have engaged in. I'm talking about Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, but also a lesser known, although now increasingly better known, college athlete named, again, Kaylin Brackett. And so just want to sort of set up so I can share with you this talk, because I'm not going to share with you the whole talk, obviously, but I want to share with you a couple minutes of her describing that evening when she heard the news from her roommate about how do I do this? Oh yeah, share sound, about Katie Meyer. And I think I will leave the rest of this to Kaylin Bracken. Let's hear it from the TED stage. This is this last fall.
And then on March 1st of 2022, my roommate came back to our room with the news that Stanford women's soccer goalkeeper Katie Meyer had died by suicide. And I remember vividly reading the headlines and the articles that night, and I had this pit in my stomach that I had had so many times before, because she wasn't the first. And it's so easy for people who aren't college athletes to read those articles and think it must have been a special case, must have been a crisis. But honestly, student athletes, we read those articles and we say, I get it. We're not all on the brink of crisis, but it's really easy as a student athlete to go through those articles and understand how the factors that we experience day in and day out could overwhelm someone and lead to that kind of crisis. So that night I sat down and I wrote a letter to college sports, basically saying it could have been any of us. And it was published a month later on April 1st of 2022, and it would go viral within a week of publication, being picked up by Good Morning America and USA Lacrosse magazine. And I got hundreds of messages from student athletes past and present in the days after publication telling me, I don't know how you did it, but you put my experience into words that they could never find. And those messages were lovely. I was happy that it was resonating, but the memory I think back to when I think of the day that this was published was actually a reaction from a staff member at my college. This person sent me a text that said, I can't believe how dark this piece was. This was so difficult to read. I can't believe we didn't know you felt this way. And the part that shocked me the most was the second part, but the first part I felt discouraged by, and then I realized it was okay. It was okay if someone was going to call my piece dark or difficult to read, if it meant that they could grasp the gravity of the subject matter. Although I did kind of think it was like watching a Tarantino film and then being like, this is really scary. Why? Why was it so scary? I was writing about student athletes dying, and of course it was going to be heavy. I didn't want to be writing it any more than she wanted to be reading it.
Yeah, I'm going to stop it there. I mean, it's a talk well worth watching in its entirety. But I want to dig a moment. I want to dig in a little bit to some of the specific content of that letter to college sports. But at first, I wanted to say that, so I teach undergraduates, and part of what fills me up in my job is people do extraordinary things that come out of kind of ordinary actions. And it's the extraordinary and the ordinary. Around a topic which, of course, as Kaylin says, is very dark, right? We're talking about mental health problems among athletes, among female athletes, again, it's emblematic of a broader problem in our society. it's nice to know that there's a silver lining that someone like Kaylin Bracken is doing the kind of work she's doing, because we need more Kaylin Brackens out there, and she's really kind of, I think, at the beginning of something very, very big here. And so what I want to do is I want to just share with you. It's a fairly lengthy essay, and I think it's worth looking up if you're so inclined, called "A Letter to College Sports," to read it on your own. But we're not going to read the whole thing together. What I've done is I've highlighted just 3 small sections that I think say some really important things. So the first is just the way she starts, right? I recently reposted a trending quote that read, "We have to put the person before the student and the athlete. Otherwise, we are at risk of losing all 3." The post was written in the wake of the passing of Katie Meyer, a standout goalie for the women's soccer team at Stanford. And I want to suggest to you that there's something unbelievably powerful that all 3 of these women, right? We're talking about the 2 names that you probably knew before coming tonight, right? Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. And now the one name that you probably didn't know that is someone to watch moving forward, Kaylin Bracken, who are saying something that is very unconventional in the world of sports. And in fact, the more I teach my class of sport and society, the more I realize how hard it is for athletes to do this. And that is for them to see themselves and for others to see them as people before they're athletes. And it's not just these women who are making this point around mental illness. I mean, this is really, if you go back to Colin Kaepernick, for example, who is, really saying, look, I might be a football player and there's 50,000 fans in the stadium who are excited to cheer for me when I'm in a uniform, I'm all good, right? But when I leave this stadium, I'm a Black American, and I too might be subject to police violence. So really the idea of the person comes before the athlete, I think, is very, very powerful in the ways in which we're seeing an effort here to destigmatize mental illness and really make a more powerful statement beyond mental illness. The second part I want to highlight from the letter to college sports is where Kaylin says, playing a college sport is just hard. It is really hard. And if you like to have a life outside of your sport, which many of us student athletes do, go figure, right? You're then taking on a self-imposed responsibility to maintain your academics, your social life, your career, and your relationships, all the while learning to navigate complicated feelings, conflict, the wavering sense of worthiness, and having your basic psychological needs met as a young adult. And this is, her words echo something that I in a book of mine that I just finished that I think is goes well beyond this subject, where I'm looking at 12 different social problems in American society, and one of the chapters is about mental illness and suicide. And I wrote a profile on Katie Meyer, which really is gets into some of the detail of what's in the quote in front of you here. And I just want to read a passage from that, because I think it kind of gets at the heart of what Kaylin Bracken is talking about. And here's what I wrote. As a student athlete at a renowned university where people carry high expectations for excellence, both in the classroom and on the field, Katie Meyer, we're talking about Stanford University now, Katie Meyer was prone to placing a greater premium on her accomplishments than on her mental health. Many student athletes struggle with perfectionism, the tendency to exert constant pressure on oneself to perform at the highest level and to appear flawless. Now, of course, setting high expectations is often a positive characteristic, right? One's chances of graduating from college are greater if it's their ambition to do so than if it isn't. But because perfectionists set unattainable goals, they are inclined towards self-criticism for not reaching them. So there's a big story here that I'm only pointing to, and I'm not going to go into any more detail, though we can talk about it in the Q&A. I'm going to stop in a couple moments. That's really about how the whole culture around college athletics is fueling this perfectionism. And the final point I want to leave you with from Kaylin Bracken, and also I'll stop talking after this, is when she says here on the bottom of the second page, when she says, when mental toughness is the answer to student athletes who are dreading waking up and going to practice the next day, I need to be with you. I need it to be you, the adult. She's talking here, of course, to parents, if kids are, high school or younger, or really to coaches, right? I need it to be you, the adult, who says that it's okay to take a step back. It is okay to reconsider the angle at which you're coming at this from. It's okay to take away it's okay to take time away from the sport, because it really is okay. And the more we resist the idea that we're allowed to stop or to walk away or to take a day off or admit to someone that we're struggling, the more we begin to feel trapped, the more we feel backed up against the wall with no other options than to take the worst way out. And I think, although she doesn't use these words, I think what Kaylin Bracken is shining the brightest possible spotlight on, which is something I spent a great deal of time discussing with my students, is this mindset that pervades sports culture in American society. And it is not a universal mindset around the world, right? It is a peculiarly American mindset that athletes must win at all costs, and they must sacrifice their bodies and their mental health and whatever it takes to do that. So I think what Kaylin Bracken is saying is so important, which echoes what Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka did so explicitly, is to say, no, the sport is not going to come first, right? I'm not going to win at all costs, because the costs, if allowed to go unchecked and uncared for, as we've seen, unfortunately, with too many athletes taking their own lives, can be catastrophic. So I want to stop there and see if people have any questions and where people would like to take the conversation.
Well, Ira, thanks so much for what you've given us so far. And I'm going to give people a few minutes to go ahead, and if you've got questions, you're welcome to put it in the chat if you like. Or if you want to raise your hand, I'll take you off mute. And while we're waiting, Ira, I'm kind of curious if, I'm reminded of a professional basketball player, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, who took time off away from the sport, I believe, because he was dealing with maybe depression. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but he returned. And I'm curious to know if, especially at the professional and team level, if, are there athletes who have suffered any backlash by their teams or their coaches or team owners, that sort of thing? Anything you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking and pointing to a male athlete, Tara, because this is, I mean, the short answer is absolutely. And I didn't talk about we all know, whether we see it firsthand or we hear about it secondhand, about the kind of the bile that exists on social media in general, and that people who are in the public eye experience, and that women are more likely to experience it than men. And so I'll get to your question about men in a moment, but Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka have dealt with all sorts of backlash, in fortunately only in words and not in actions. But I think it's very telling that these are two women that have gone to this extent. Men have done things to a smaller degree. I think men potentially risk a greater backlash. I think there's, and it's wrapped up in things about, like, one's conception of his own masculinity is about being tough and about being able to kind of, if for men who really embrace a certain kind of orthodox version of what it means to be masculine, and the idea that you're going to sort of succumb to your own weaknesses goes against so much of what they've learned throughout their careers as athletes, to be tough, right? That mental toughness is actually, often seen as an asset. And so, men have, there've been some men who have tinkered with this, and I think, I don't hold the crystal ball in the future, just as no one else does here, of course, but there's something incredibly exciting about this topic, and to see how this is going to change, because as with any kind of social change and any kind of activism, sometimes you just need a couple people in the right position to really kind of ignite something. And I think we're seeing, we can't see it fully now because you can only see it in retrospect, but I think we're seeing the beginning of a very significant movement here that, I think what Kaylin Bracken is doing is bringing it down to a level that's very relatable to people who are obviously, are not star-studded athletes.
All right, I think we have a question. Benjamin?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I really appreciated how you drew a dichotomy between athletes on the field versus athletes as human beings. And it made me wonder how some of us here are probably really big fans and might be unintentionally enabling some of this behavior. So my question is, what role do fans play in not exacerbating existing mental health crises in the field? And is this the responsibility of individual fans, or is there more systemic change that's needed across different sports?
Yeah, fans have a huge role here, right? Because fans, reinforce, athletes are made, certainly those in the public eye, right? We talk about the two, Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka first, and we can talk about college athletes after. Their celebrity, their fame is built by people wanting to see them and see them win. And I think fans have a critical role to play here in sort of staring at their own mirrors, if you will, and recognizing that there's something more important than winning. And because, there's this sort of vicarious experience that many of us, and I'm using the word us because I have been and still to some degree am a sports fan, but by being a fan, one participates in validating the kinds of behaviors and personas that athletes take on. And so I think for fans to say that this is not only reasonable, but it's actually courageous. I think it's one of the most courageous things a person could do is to not compete when there's something more going on than trying to please their audience. Now one might say, and I think it's a reasonable thing to say, look, Simone Biles didn't do this in 2016, right? She won many gold medals and then did this. Naomi Osaka, it was pretty high in the tennis circuit and then did this. It would take there'd be more to lose if you do this before you achieve fame, because but then again, people might not take them as seriously. So but anyway, just zeroing on the question, I think fans really have to validate this and have to see this as an act as courageous as anything they do on the field or court, as opposed to something that is somehow anti-athletic because they are not competing.
Great. Well, we've got a couple questions in the chat, so why don't I read you the first one? Mira has asked for thoughts on individual sports versus team sports and mental health.
Well, if you're, it's revealing, right? Both of these women are in individual. Well, gymnastics is tricky, right? Because you're part of a team, and I guess I'm going to show how little I know about how gymnastics is scored here. You are kind of letting down your team, but you're competing as an individual. And I think actually Simone Biles did come back and compete in 2021 in a team event. And so, it might have been more courageous for her. I guess to the point of the question is it's harder to do this when there's a team counting on you, as opposed to just your own sense of how much you want to win, and your fans, to the point of the previous question, how they see it. It's easier for an individual athlete to do this. Again, I don't hold the crystal ball on where this is going, but I think as more athletes do this kind of thing and do it, this is not a stunt. This is not a gotcha. This is a, I'll say I'm not talking about myself as if I'm the athlete, I'm suffering, and my suffering is not idiosyncratic to me. It is emblematic of a cultural problem in American sport. So I think we're going to see athletes on teams doing it, but it's going to be the next wave, because there's more to risk, because you have other people who are immediately let down, especially if you're key to the team. But I think that's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we've got one more. What evidence is there that winning at all costs is not a prevailing thought internationally?
In my sport and society course, we talk about so this topic about athletes as activists, and another topic we talk about, which is probably the one that students in the class, many of whom are athletes, no surprise in a course like that, what they find very relevant is that the role of sports in childhood, and which is where we sort of talk about this idea of the win at all costs mindset. And I share with them a very short essay, but a very powerful essay about the system of youth sports in Norway. And it is, and the author says a very important point that Norway is a country that does extremely well in the Olympics, or at least the Winter Olympics, right? They've actually won the most medals. So, and then goes on to talk about how that system, you're not even allowed to keep score until age 13. I mean, kids are encouraged to play, for a lot of the reasons that we as parents and coaches, I coach my kids a little bit, not with much success, but as parents and coaches give lip service to little kids, like, it's about how hard, how much you enjoy the game, and it's about, making friends and all these things that we kind of give lip service to, and then quickly very much pivot to the idea that winning is really what matters. And my students have so many stories about how about their bodies are literally, they're in pain because of injuries they've played through because they felt like they've had to or been pushed to do it. In Norway, there's none of that. Now, it's an entirely different country in many, many ways, but they really value participation. They really value a child's mental health in a way that I think, this country is, I mean, maybe one of the silver linings, if that's the right way to put it, of the fact that there is a mental health crisis among young people is I think not just in the context of what I've talked about tonight with sports, but moreover, I think we're starting to take mental health, mental illness among young people more seriously because it's such a crisis. But we're not dealing with the root of it, which is this kind of competitiveness. And I've only talked about the athletic competitiveness. We can talk about academic competitiveness. That will be for another evening. But yeah, thank you. It's a really important question.
Okay. So Kenley, if you'd like to, you can take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. What the question that I have is similar to the previous question, but what I wanted to ask concerning that question was, how do you think the way our society view athletes, like the structure, how does it affect them from making such a decision where it comes to where it seems like they're sacrificing their mental health for in order to become an athlete? They're putting their athletic lives before a person, before being a student, before actually being themselves. What impact do you think is the winning at all cost mentality, where you feel like in order for me to win, I gotta sacrifice this, I gotta sacrifice that?
Well, first of all, I want everyone to know that Kenley's a student in my class. Kenley, I'm really happy you're here. It's awesome. In teaching this class, I have developed a respect and appreciation for student athletes that I admittingly did not have beforehand. And I think, in fairness to myself, could not have had beforehand, because I see firsthand the kinds of things that Kaylin Bracken is talking about. And it's, Framingham State is a Division III school, and I'm not going to get into all the differences between Division I, II, and III, but the pressures are less at a Division III school. And yet many athletes at Framingham State, like any athlete at any level of college, is in a real bind. I mean, as I said to you earlier, the role, I said to all of you earlier, and Kenley knows this from being in the class, it's not my role to tell students what to think, right? So it's not when I teach about this, it's not like, isn't Simone Biles a hero for putting her mental illness, her mental health first, yeah, join the cause. Again, I'm not taking sides here. And I would never say to students, you should walk away from your sport. And mainly, because it's not my position to tell them that, and they shouldn't listen to me, but I realize how hard it is to do that. And what saddens me is that, and this says a lot about the role that sports plays in American youth culture, and ties in with what I've been talking about tonight, is that lots of young people who have played sports since they were 3 or 4 and are playing college sports don't really know of other options of how they could spend their time. And I don't want to make this point and leave you thinking that they think, or I think, that there isn't a lot of redeeming value for them to continue to play sports. There's tremendous value, but the mental health impacts that I described tonight are just about any student in my class who plays sports can talk about them and talk about the kinds of personal sacrifices they make. And so, to your point, Kenley, which is such a good one, I think people are in a real bind because every force in the culture that they've encountered has been sort of propping up the and validating the worthiness of their sport. And there's nothing wrong with sports being worthy, but I think when it comes at the expense of so much, and of course tonight I only talked about mental health, which is certainly not an only, but what about lots of other activities that one could engage in and meaningfully? And I'll never forget that. And again, I didn't push this or script it or want it to happen, but 2 years ago I had a student after the semester tell me that she was walking away from her sport because of the class, and she realized that she needed to put herself first. And I thought it was a tremendous act of courage. And I want to just end tonight and leave you with just a couple of thoughts, all of you. And again, Kenley, thank you for that question. And a couple of thoughts related to the heroism. And I think I've said a couple of times tonight, I don't know the future any more than anyone else, but I do know that there will be future sports historians who are going to talk about Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. And I have a reasonable amount of confidence, and I certainly have a great amount of hope that these historians may well look back on the careers of these women and say that the most heroic thing any of them did, after talking about their respective accolades on the tennis court and the balance beam, and the thing for which they will be most remembered is not competing in the summer of 2021. And the same, I believe, is true for any athlete who decides that, or he's able to gather up the steam, which is now slightly easier to gather up because of the path that's been paved by the women I've described tonight. For any athlete who puts themselves before sports, I think is something that might be their greatest achievement as an athlete, is not competing. Because I think we can all agree that heroism is really about standing up to a set of social expectations in a sports culture that, as something we're going to talk about in the course in a couple of weeks, a sports culture that really, at its root, creates many broken human beings. So I have a lot of confidence in the heroism of athletes to be able to kind of join this movement that's slowly taking steam, that's acting as a counterforce to the win-at-all-cost mindset in sports. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and listening and being part of this conversation. I think it's super important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ira. If you feel like you have time, we've got one more question in the chat.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a little on the long side, so give me a little time to read it. It wouldn't be shocking if we heard that male athletes would have more social pressures to be tough as a component of masculine norms than female athletes, and male suicide rate is higher than female in the wider community. Yet it sounds, like among athletes, females experience these more than males. Any thoughts regarding possible causes for the differential experiences of female versus male athletes regarding risk of suicide?
Yeah, well, this is something that goes, of course, beyond sports, right? And one thing I want you all to take away from tonight is that really this conversation about sports is a microcosm of society at large, right? There's what's called the gender paradox surrounding suicide, which is that, and this is not about athletes, this is about people, across the society, that girls and women are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, and boys and men are I can't remember the percentage. I think it's twice as likely to actually take their own lives, right? It has to do with, the latter part of that has to do with the kind of the methods chosen or used, but the former part really speaks, well, why are girls more at risk? And to be honest, I don't at this moment have a really good answer for that. I mean, I think I mean, a lot of what Kaylin Brackett is talking about, which is something. These are pressures that boys and men experience as well. It may be that the very, the person who asked the question, who's kind of at the root of the question, was this kind of like this sort of toughness mentality that pervades our culture, that pervades kind of boys and men's sense of what it means to be masculine. It may well be that kind of gives male athletes a certain amount of ammunition to kind of actually plow through mental pain, and yet that culture, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be quite as pronounced among female athletes. And I'm hedging my words a little bit because I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think it would be a better world of sports if girls and women were only tougher and kind of push through pain, because I think that's clearly part of the problem. I think it needs to be better understood. I mean, there is something I heard just yesterday, actually, which is, again, not looking at sports, but looking at the graphic I showed you about why the mental health feelings of persistent sadness are greater among teenage girls and teenage boys. And it talked about how, and the person who just wrote a book about this was focusing specifically on the role of social media, and was talking about how social media is about trying to amplify this sense of community, right? Obviously, and that you're valued as part of a community and you have worth in that community, and that seems to be something that is more kind of hardwired into girls than boys, right? Which isn't to say that boys don't care about what their friends think. Of course they do, but boys in general counterbalance that more with a sort of a sense of kind of self-focus, a sense of their own goals, whereas girls tend to be more desirous of kind of what the community wants of them or expects of them, what they believe the community wants or expects of them. So I bring it to this level because what I didn't share when I talked about Katie Meyer earlier in her story is, I mean, as with any other young person, much of their lives is broadcast on social media. And so for a female athlete, the kind of pressure to have validation as an athlete and worth as an athlete, and how that affects them mentally, seems to be greater than for male athletes in ways that I certainly want to understand better. But thank you for the question. I want to just leave you all with just one more tidbit, if I may, and it's kind of a pretty, I think, thought-provoking quote that. So when I ask my students to when we talk about this topic, we read one essay written by a New York Times columnist named Kurt Streeter. Some of you may have read him. He's really quite sharp, and he wrote this essay. It was mostly focusing on Simone Biles. The essay was called, like, "The Power of No." And there's one point in the essay that he just says something extremely provocative, and I think is a very thought-provoking way for us to end tonight. So there's Kurt Streeter, and he says, and again, this is talking about Simone Biles, early in the essays. He says, "We live in a society that simultaneously worships athletes like magical gods and treats them like disposable objects." And if you ended the quote there and you think about that juxtaposition, right? If you're LeBron James, you're a magical god now, but what's going to happen when LeBron James isn't playing basketball anymore? The idea of being disposable. Fans, reporters, leagues, global organizations like the International Olympic Committee all form an ecosystem in which too few care about the pain athletes endure, the broken bones, the brain injuries, and mental health woes. Right. And I think what's interesting in this quote, of course, is that he's talking about professionals, right? But if you think about how this same kind of ecosystem exists, certainly for Division I sports, like all the athletes, the 5 women who took their own lives, and Kaylin Bracken, who is an athlete at a Division I school at Vanderbilt, right? Certainly has lots of similarities to pros, right? So long as they are there for our entertainment, it's all good. And, this really gets back to the question that was asked earlier about the role that fans have to play in this, right? Because we as fans legitimately want to be entertained, right? By athletes. Nothing wrong with that, but it's that benign motive of wanting to be entertained that actually clashes with or has a problematic implication, which is that wanting to be entertained can easily lead fans to be disappointed in or or think less of athletes if they are putting themselves before the game, and to, you know, and to dispose of them. Because to many fans, what good really is Simone Biles if she's not winning gold medals? That's not my view. But again, I want to emphasize to you my own personal view, and it's a view that's, I think, is substantiated by the activism that I've talked about tonight, that while it may take heroism to win on a big stage, it takes even more heroism to not even compete on that stage. So thank you all for coming out tonight and listening. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Ira. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and a wonderful presentation and a really timely and important topic.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night.